The Lives of the Saints by Father Alban Butler. September 17th, Stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi. In the month of August 1224, St. Francis of Assisi withdrew from the world for a season to commune with God on the summits of La Verna, a deserted mountain in the Apennines. On the occasion he was accompanied by Brother Leo and 5 or 6 other friars, but Francis wished to be apart and chose his dwelling in a solitary hut under a beech tree on the opposite side of the mountain, and before cloistering himself there, he instructed his brothers that none should approach his abode except Leo when he had to bring him food. At about the time of the feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, the saint was praying in front of his hut, raising his soul to God with seraphic ardor, and was seized by a deep charity, a tender and loving compassion for him who was crucified for love of us. He was in this state when he saw the figure of what seemed to be a seraph with 6 shining wings descending from the heavens towards him in a very rapid flight until it hovered in the air in front of the saint. Then he could see, between the wings of the seraphim, the figure of a crucified man with his hands and feet stretched out and nailed to the cross. The wings of the seraph were differently placed. The 2 upper ones were stretched upward, above the head of the crucified man. The middle ones were spread out for flight, and the lower pair were folded on themselves as if to cover or support the body of the crucified man. At the sight of such an apparition, the heart of Francis was seized with a sudden joy, to which was mingled a feeling of deep sorrow. The neighboring presence of his Lord, in the form of a seraph who fixed his eyes on him with a kind and gentle gaze, gave him immense joy, but at the same time, the sight of his crucified body pierced his soul with pain. At that moment, an inner light made the saint understand that although the condition of the crucified did not correspond to the immortality of the seraphim, the marvelous vision manifested itself to him so that he could understand that he was going to be transformed into a likeness of Jesus Christ on the cross, not in the martyrdom of his flesh, but in the heart by the fire of his love. Suddenly the seraph came closer and wounded the saint in body and soul, so that Francis experienced intense pain and felt great fear until the seraph spoke to explain to him many things that had been hidden from him. After a few moments that seemed like centuries, the vision disappeared, but the soul of the saint burned inside the body that seemed to have received the image of the crucified with such force that it was imprinted on him, as if his flesh had been marked by a seal imprinted by a supernatural and extraordinary force. On the hands and feet of the saint, wounds similar to those he had contemplated in the vision of the crucified man began to open. In the center of his hands and feet, 4 perforations opened up that resembled the holes left by 4 thick nails driven into the flesh. Around the wounds, on the palms of his hands and the instep of his feet, the round black mark of the head of the nails was visible. The long points appeared on the front and tore the skin because they were twisted, as if they had been struck with a hammer. Also, on the saint's right side, there was a red wound that looked as if it had been made by the point of a spear. From all those wounds, blood gushed out and stained the saint's clothes. That marvelous miracle took place at the same time that the understanding of Francis was filled with clear ideas about Christ crucified, and the love that filled his heart was employed with all the strength of his will to concentrate on the beloved object and to assimilate himself to the beloved being in the moments of greatest suffering, so that by the imaginative faculties of his soul, he formed a second crucified with a reality so vivid that the impressions of his mind affected the matter of his body. The external marks of the wounds in the flesh of St. Francis, which the internal love of his heart could not produce, were caused by the fiery seraph, or rather by Christ himself, who, in the vision, had hurled fiery rays from the 5 wounds to shape outwardly in St. Francis those painful marks which the love of the saint had already impressed inwardly on his soul. Whether or not St. Francis was the first human being to be so marked by the stigmata, from the Greek stigmata meaning marks, of our crucified Lord, there can be no doubt that he is the most famous and the most authentic example from that time to recent and present times. Moreover, it is the only prodigy of its kind that the entire Western Church commemorates with a liturgical feast. The realization and the general development of the phenomenon are beyond doubt. Brother Leo refers to it in the note he wrote in his own handwriting on the Seraphic blessings dispensed to St. Francis, a document preserved by the friars of the convent of Assisi. Brother Elias also refers to it in the letter he wrote to the friars of France to announce the Patriarch's death in 1226. Since the beginning of time, writes the friar, such a marvel had not been seen, except in the case of the Son of God, who is Christ our Lord. For a long time before his death, our father and brother seemed crucified, and there appeared on his body the 5 wounds, which are truly the stigmata of Christ. For in his hands and feet were open from part to part 5 holes, like those made by nails driven in from top to bottom, which were open sores, black perforations in the shape of nails. Also his side seemed to have been pierced by a lance, and blood often flowed from all the wounds. In the oldest biography of the saint, written 2 to 4 years after his death, the stigmata are described in this way. His hands and feet seemed to have been pierced by nails, whose heads had left the marks on the palms of the hands and the front parts of the feet, while the marks of the tips were on the back of the hands and the soles of the feet. However, these marks were round on the palms of the hands and on the instep of the feet, while on the reverse side they were elongated and had protuberances, as if the points of the nails had projected out portions of the flesh, and as if these points had been bent by blows in such a way as to tear the skin. The marks on the soles of the feet were of the same shape and character. In addition, on the right side, he had an open wound in the shape of a crescent moon, with lips similar to that which would make the point of a spear, and from which blood frequently flowed. The Book of Miracles, written by an eyewitness to the events it describes, Thomas of Celano, 20 years after they occurred, adds that the crowds that flocked to Assisi could see in their hands and feet not the wounds, but the nails themselves, marvelously formed by the power of God, and truly nailed into the flesh, but in a strange form, as if they were part of the flesh itself, and in such a way that if they were pressed on one side, they formed a protrusion on the opposite side, and when they stopped pressing them, they returned to their original place. The statement mentioned above, and that Alban Butler made of the little flowers, to the effect that the points of the nails protruded and were bent on themselves until they formed an almost closed hook in which the finger of the hand could be inserted, as if by a ring.